You are listening to the Thoughts from a Page podcast, which is a member of the Evergreen Podcasts Network. My name is Cindy Burnett, and I love to talk about books with anyone and everyone. While listening to my podcast, you will hear author interviews, behind-the-scenes conversations about various aspects of the publishing world, theme discussions with other book lovers, and more. For more book recommendations and a complete list of all of my interviews, check out my website, thoughtsfromapage.com, and follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Thoughts From a Page. In 2022, I would love for you to join my Patreon group. I offer at least 2 bonus episodes a month and a monthly advanced read and pre-publication author chat. For those on Facebook, I host a special Patreon Facebook group where we all chat books. Thanks so much to those who already participate, and I hope you will consider joining us. Today, David J. Dennis joins me to chat about his new book, The Movement Made Us. His work has been featured in Atlanta Magazine, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and Huffington Post, among other publications. He is the recipient of the 2021 American Mosaic Journalism Prize for his 2020 cover story in Atlanta Magazine, Ahmaud Arbery Will Not Be Erased, which sheds light on the injustice and historical pattern leading up to the murder of a young Black man in Georgia, as well as his piece, An Ode to the Black Women at Dillard's, published in Roxane Gay's Gay Mag. He is a National Association of Black Journalists Salute to Excellence Award winner and was named one of the Root's 100 Most Influential African Americans of 2020. He lives in Georgia with his wife and 2 children and is a graduate of Davidson College. I hope you enjoy our conversation. And now for a quick break. For the last year, I have been focusing more on my health and eating habits. In connection with that, I have started drinking AG1 in the morning. When I started drinking AG1 daily, I could feel a real difference in my health and energy levels. That is because AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that supports your body's universal needs like gut optimization, stress management, and immune support. Since 2010, AG1 has led the future of foundational nutrition, continuously refining their formula to create a smarter, better way to elevate your baseline health. I recommend AG1 to all of my family and friends because the company has a team of doctors and scientists. It is tested for 950 contaminants and is NSF certified for sport. It is formulated based on the latest science, and it maintains high quality standards. Thanks AG1 for sponsoring my show. AG1 is a supplement I trust to provide the support my body needs daily. If you want to take ownership of your health, it starts with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. That's drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. Check it out. And now back to my show. Welcome, David. How are you today?
I'm doing okay. As we're recording, I'm about 3 weeks away from release date. So, if I start hyperventilating or freaking out in the middle of this, then you'll know why.
Well, it's a wonderful book, so there's absolutely nothing to freak out about. But I know that when the countdown is on, it does get pretty nerve-wracking.
Yeah. So we're at this, this in-between point where we're just sort of waiting. And thank you, first of all, thank you for the kind words. And, I am holding on to every sort of positive feedback that I can get at this point to sort of help me sleep at night.
The reviews have been great. I was looking over them this morning. I always like to see what people have to say before I do an interview. And you have all sorts of wonderful comments and reviews. So you must be very excited and proud.
Yeah, I am. I do a lot of, for my writing, I review things and I give feedback. So being on the other side is a very strange feeling. But everything has been, extremely, positive so far. We got a coveted Kirkus star, which I understand, which I wasn't all the way familiar with. I mean, I knew Kirkus and everything before, but I wasn't totally understanding, what that really, really meant. So I was excited about that. That was actually the first review we got. So everything else has been great. The bookstagrammers have been fantastic and supportive and positive. So yes, that's all been wonderful.
Yes, a star from Kirkus. When I saw that, I thought you're golden.
Okay. All right. It's good to know.
Because that does not happen very often.
Good.
What I usually do when I start out an interview is have the author tell me a little bit about the book. So those that won't have read it yet will have a little bit of context before I start asking questions. So would you like to tell me a little bit about The Movement Made Us?
Yeah. So The Movement Made Us is my dad's story. I wrote from his perspective. about his time in the movement from 1961 to 1964, sort of beginning with pickets and protests in New Orleans all the way through the Freedom Rides and, through the Freedom Summer of 1964. And sort of interspersed in that is my thoughts on how that time impacted him as a father and our relationship, and me as a father and a husband and all that stuff, and sort of our relationship, and how, we came together and put this book together.
And how relevant it is, sadly, to the world we're living in today.
Yeah, it sort of was conceptualized a lot during, the Trump administration, to be quite frank, and a lot of the thoughts about, how far we've come, how far we still have to go. And it was, through writing this and through doing research and learning new things about my dad and his time, there are so many stories that could be happening in 2022 that happened in the 60s.
That's the part that I think is really hard to grasp. It's really hard to grasp for me, so I'm sure it's also incredibly hard to grasp for you. So you just wonder, why have we not made more progress? But what I thought was interesting was the format. I like that you were telling your father's story and then you interspersed it with your 4 letters. How did you go about getting your father's story down? What did that process look like?
So, a lot of these stories, as you can imagine, I had heard in some context growing up, right? He'd sort of told the stories, sometimes in passing, sometimes it'd be more detailed than the other time. Sometimes some details would be a little different each time, just based on how he remembered it. And they were always just super compelling, almost like episodic stories on their own. And early on, when I was a kid, and wanted to be a writer, I was like, one day I'm going to write my dad's stories. I'm going to put it in a book somehow. And I didn't want to do a straight up biography. The memoir form was always interesting to me, but I wanted to, get these stories directly, from him. So it just started with, I just sat him down. I said, Dad, we're going to try to do this book. I sat him down. I went and got his stories first. It was sort of an unconventional way than I would traditionally do interviews, where I would do a ton of research ahead of time and talk to them, based on the research I had. I just sort of went blind and asked my dad, like, let's just tell me everything that you can remember. And I would ask follow-ups based on those memories. And then I circled back around and did the research and pieced the blanks together, pieced the chronology together as best I could. And, we really sort of worked together. Like, I would write, a chapter based on his stories, based on the research, and I would sort of fill in some blanks with things that he wasn't sure about, and that would help jog his memory, and we get as close to, his recollection as possible. I mean, there was a lot of moments of excavating some really sort of deeply hidden stuff that he hadn't thought about in 60 years, and trying to pull that out and trying to make it, get it as close to what happened as possible. And there were some painful times for both of us trying to make it work. But, we worked real close throughout the whole process. It wasn't sort of like this thing where I interviewed him and I just went off and wrote a book.
Hoped it was all right.
Yeah, and hoped it right. So that wasn't the case. We would get together every Sunday. We were going to travel a lot and go to some of these places, but COVID hit right in the middle of the book process. And so we would just sit on Zoom and, try to put each other into those scenes and into those moments, and put those moments on the page.
And how was that for him? As you said, I'm sure at times it was painful. Was he excited to have his story told? Was he a little anxious? Was he happy to have it all out into the world? How did he feel about it?
It depends on what day it was, what day it was, honestly. Like, there were some stories that, like, he is always about shining the light on the no named, or the people who are underrepresented in the history book. So he was always excited about, talking about the C.O. Chins and the Amzie Moores and Doris Castles and people like that. But, really having him recreate sort of the most painful moments, his last moments with Medgar Evers, the eulogy that he delivered for James Chaney. My dad had not reread it. since, since it happened. He has watched clips, but he hasn't really sort of been in that moment since then. So that was extremely painful. And then the letters, which were, I wrote two, three of them to him, and they were hard for him to read. They were hard for me to write. They were hard for him to read and sort of face, his son talking to him candidly about our relationship. So there were times where it was joyful. We had a great time. Sometimes we'd go out and hang out and talk about things. And there were times where it was just really, really difficult. And I had to keep pushing him to sort of get to the truth of what happened.
Well, and for him to face that you didn't feel like he was always that great a father because he was out and about a bunch trying to do so much of this. And I think it's hard when you have people like that, activists that are trying to change the world and are very focused on what they're doing. And what they're doing is wonderful, but it sometimes means that their family life is not quite as easy as it could be.
Yeah. I mean, when you are in a space where you are sure you are going to die at the age of 21, right? It makes it difficult for you to think about planning for your future and think about things that deal with longevity and stability. And one of those things is a family. And, it was difficult. My dad was back headfirst into a movement in the 90s with the Algebra Project and math literacy in the schools, and back in Mississippi and back fighting this crusade. And parts of our relationship were not, what they could have been otherwise. And it was difficult. My parents divorced at, when I was 11. My dad traveled a lot. And as a kid, I saw our relationship as part of the sacrifice that you just make. I was sacrificing for the greater part of the movement. And, now that I have my own family and want to do things differently, it sort of crystallized me and my dad's relationship, but also the story sort of crystallized, how my dad came to be who he was by the age of 45 when I was born. And I think that, we have a better understanding of what happened. But yeah, I mean, our family shouldn't, like, my dad and I should not have the relationship that we have now, but considering everything that he went through.
Well, and I'm sure writing this book together was very cathartic for both of you, to be able to work through some of those issues and for you to better understand and for him to better understand what you were thinking.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it caused us to have conversations that we had not had before. It caused us to be honest with each other in ways that we had not before. I mean, you can forget, like, there's a tendency to sort of forgive and love through things without always having those come to Jesus moments. And we had some of those come to Jesus moments through the book. And I think, the good thing is, as now we are in a better place on the other side of the book. Even, even when we started this book, we were in a good place, but now we're in an even better place.
I just really felt for him for those early 1960s times, particularly. And I hadn't really thought about it from the perspective when you analogize it to Vietnam. And I'm sure he did have PTSD. How could you not from some of the things that he experienced? But I just hadn't thought about it that way before. And that analogy really hit home for me. And I've thought so much about it since I read your book.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm gonna go back a little bit because my part of the conception of this book happened in high school when my high school teacher, Miss Williams, shout out to Miss Williams, she was wonderful. We read The Things They Carry, the Tim O'Brien book about Vietnam, and as I was reading it, and reading some of the things that he was thinking, things he was going through, I was like, a lot of this stuff sort of sounds like how dad feels and what dad talks about. And when I started writing the book, I started writing the book thinking of this book, I mean, as a war book, as a book about war in America. And these were people who were fighting nonstop. I mean, day after day on enemy turf. There was no home base for them to go to. There was no place to sleep at night where you felt safe. And it was nonstop. And yes, they dealt with bombings and spies and organized government assault. And, it feels like I mean, and dad has said it before, he felt like a war general sending people off to die. So this really felt, it was written in that sort of way to make this feel like a war book and to make people understand and think about what does it mean that people had to fight a war in America just to have equal rights because of the color of their skin.
Absolutely. And I think framing it that way was very helpful for me. But I had read Buses Are a Comin' last year, and I really thought a lot as I read that book about the 1961 freedom rides and about how horrible it would be for me as a white person to be so upset about people I don't even know to like show up at a bus stop and throw things. Like, it's just so foreign to me. I don't understand how you can have that level of hatred for people you don't even know just based on the color of their skin. So I had really kind of focused on that aspect of it, like, what is wrong with people? But then when I was reading your story, I was thinking about how horrible it would be for those people fighting day in, day out. It's obviously horrible all the time to worry about being pulled over when you're driving your car, not doing anything wrong, or living in your home, or whatever else it is. But just to really think about those people that were fighting on the front lines and agreeing to ride the buses, knowing they were going to be met by these angry mobs with nooses and guns and bottles, that takes a lot. I mean, that's a really strong person to be able to do that.
Yeah, and at the same time, they were even more protected than the local people. Like when Dad went to jail, there was a Watts line, like a network of calls and ways that you can make sure that he was safe. They had bail money that would come every few days. Like if he went missing, people would go find him. He had access to John Doerr, who was a government, official who could help get him out of jail. But there were folks, who were in families in Greenville, Mississippi, and families in Canton, families that did not have access to that, who were also sort of equally on the front lines. Like if you took in a freedom, a Freedom Summer volunteer in the summer of '64, and you fed them, you put your life in danger, and there was nobody who was going to come and make sure that you were okay. And I think one of the things I want people to get from that book is that everybody who did anything for the movement, whether you were riding a bus, whether you were doing a sit-in, or whether you were just simply feeding a volunteer, or driving them around, or introducing them to people, or even just registering the vote, like you were under siege. And there are so many people whose names we never know and never will know, whose lives were impacted and lost and taken just for trying to live in America.
Trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. I mean, they were trying to do the right thing. They were trying to actively survive. Like they were trying to actively do what's best for their families, and they were getting, massacred for it.
Well, and the craziest part of it to me is that it's people wanting rights they should already have, rights that other people have. It's just basic common decency most of the time. And it's just so awful to think that you have to fight for that then and now.
Yeah. I mean, as much of this book was written, probably maybe half or so of this book was written, and definitely all of it was revised and everything in the post George Floyd era, and it was written in a time where we're watching videos of Black people getting killed by police for doing, nothing, for, walking down the street or sleeping in their apartments. And, it just highlights, this is nonstop. It just feels nonstop. And it feels like we can look at the past, we can look at the South and say that these things are relegated to the 60s or Mississippi. And we see that this is a pervasive way that of America. And also what's just as pervasive is folks, determination to fight it and overcome it.
Absolutely. And it's wonderful to read a story about those people that are fighting to overcome it. And as you said, people large and small, doing small things, doing large things on the front line in secret, however it is, those people that are working to make it better.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and one of the things I loved is learning about a lot of the people who I just grew up with, who were friends of my dad, who I saw as uncles and aunts, and just knowing what they did. And then they went on and like became whatever, teachers or whatever, and just lived the rest of their lives. But they have these, monumental stories. I hope people read and go talk to their parents and grandparents to ask them a lot of questions about their stories, because there's a million stories that are probably just as riveting as Dad's story.
Well, I Googled a number of the people that you had coming and going in your home when you were younger, when you mentioned them. Some names I was familiar with, but the ones I wasn't, I went ahead and looked up just to see what they had done so I would be familiar with them.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, that's my hope. I hope that people do that. And, like I said, there are just so many stories of folks who I would just sit down and hear these stories and just could not believe what I was hearing. I mean, there were so many that could be in the book that we just didn't have space for. And I hope that somebody or there's some way that these are chronicled as much as possible.
You can write a second book.
I can't even think about a second book.
I'm just kidding. I don't want to add to your panic for the 3
Right.
weeks. Well, what was the hardest part about writing this book?
Well, the hardest part, well, there's a couple. There's like sort of emotional hardest part and like logistical hardest part. I think sort of from my dad's story, the hardest part was writing about Mrs. Hamer getting beaten in the Winona jail. Just hearing the story of what she went through, the brutality of it, of this woman who had already been through so much, and what happened to her, and sort of and hearing from Miss Uvester, who took care of her in the cell right afterwards, was really really painful to hear. And I had trouble even like going back and reading after I'd written it, because it was just so difficult to even comprehend. And just in the letters were incredibly difficult. The letters were really, really difficult to write. They were the last things I wrote in the book. I'd written so many attempts at writing in my voice and writing sort of my thoughts and putting them in the book that got scrapped. I probably wrote a whole book that got cut because they just weren't good. And trying to figure out where I fit in, figure out how to speak to my relationship with dad, and finally the letters, writing them in the letter sort of opened that up, because that idea did not come until the very end. Like, let me just write them as letters so we can figure out and help with the writing and making it make sense.
I was curious about that, if you had started with that format or if that was something that had come about over time. And I'll tell you, I teared up with the letter to your children. I just was like, oh.
Yeah, so that came almost heat of the moment. When I first wrote the proposal, I knew I was, going to write obviously dad's stories, and I couldn't figure out how to put myself in the story. I was sort of writing my thoughts in the footnotes, and everybody I talked to was sort of like, no, we need your voice, and it was sort of hard for me to figure out, well, who wants to hear from me? Like, my dad has been through so much. Like, nobody wants to hear what I have to say about that. Like, it's his story. But, I think there is a generational and emotional and reason for me to be part of it. I just kind of was resistant to it at the beginning. And I just was writing these chapters from my voice. They were just sort of essays, and they just weren't good. I just couldn't figure it out. I just couldn't crack the nut. And I'd already sent in my manuscript, and my editor, Gail, was sort of like, these still don't really work. And I was like, what? And I'd been thinking about, I was like, what if let me just try letters so I can just get through, what I want to say on the page. We could change it back if we want to. As I wrote the letters, I was just like, I hadn't even thought that I was going to do it. I just wrote the letters, and I was just like, I'm just going to write a letter to the kids too. And just did it sort of almost in one sitting and wrote it down. And it sort of felt like completing the circle in the book.
When I read about the book initially and then received it, I was so curious to see how the two stories would intertwine. And I really liked the way it worked out. I like you doing the letters and then you telling your father's story. I thought that worked well, and it did put your two stories together. It was just a good format for it.
Well, that's good to know. Thanks. That was definitely that was pulling teeth for me for me to make that to just figure it out. I mean, I think, one of the things is just like, and I think that there is sort of a meta commentary to be said about that, is that like I look at my dad and, what he went through, and arrests, and his friends are killed. And I'm like, well, I didn't go through that. Like, nobody wants to hear me complaining about, or my dad wasn't around enough, like I felt, almost petulant in a sort of way, and entitled in a sort of way, to even sort of think that my words deserve to be on the same page as his stories. And so I had to sort of break through that. And like I said, I was resistant to it. And there was a lot of thinking about that, especially early on, of, should we alternate chapters? Should we just, like, what should we do? And we just sort of happened, this sort of just, it worked out this way. And yeah, I in the end, I finally was happy with it, but that was probably the hardest part of the book.
I can see that. Well, what surprised you the most as you wrote the book?
Well, what surprised me was something that I kind of already knew, but I hadn't, like when you think about your parents, and your parents tell you a story, like even if your mom or dad is like, well, when I was 10, I did this, like you still envision like this old person, like in the story, right?
Right, right.
And so it wasn't until we, like I really thought about, and while I was writing some of this, I was teaching at Morehouse College here in Atlanta. And I really sort of understood how young my dad was, 21, 22, like the things that he was doing at that age, like that really hit home to me just how young he was. Just hearing these stories of the idea of him drinking before going on the Freedom Ride and things like that. Like this is what kids do, like they do things that kids do, and just thinking about how young everybody was. Like Bob Moses was, 26, I think, at the time, and he was the elder statesman. And so that was one of the things that I sort of learned. And then I guess the biggest revelation, which I talk about in the opening, is that I had sort of thought about my dad through my childhood as somebody who was settled in his place in the movement. And to learn that he was sort of coming back to the movement for the first time in 30 years throughout my childhood, to see how much he was actively working through while I was a child, was a real sort of revelation that we came to during just our conversations about the book.
And at one point in one of the chapters, you talk about that, where he originally thought all of this work would bring about a change that would be lasting and that we wouldn't be dealing with what we're dealing with now. And I really thought a lot about that too. That had to be so frustrating. And I'm sure 30 years later in the 90s, he was still trying to grapple with it all and work through it, but also just the frustration that it didn't bring about as much change as it should have.
Yeah, that was one of the early questions I had for him was, and again, you got to think about where we were, or where I was, or where the country was when I was asking him, some of these initial questions. We have this terribly racist president. We have, these videos of Black folks being killed. We have all this stuff going on in this country. And I'm asking this man, like, you lost so much. Where did you think we would be?
Right.
And, just on a personal level, I've been obviously, pulled over by police and harassed by police. Like, did you think at the age of 21 that you would be 80 with children and grandchildren who are going through the same thing you're going through, And I don't think he totally thought about that at the time. You're just thinking about, the day to day and survival. But, you have to be thinking about that, but also you have to be thinking about how much you've also where we would be if not for him and the people who were there.
Absolutely. And definitely that we would be much farther behind. And so there was definitely progress made. It's just a matter sometimes of wishing probably more progress were made. But that's probably the case with many things.
Right.
Well, how about the title and the cover? I think that the cover is beautiful. It grabbed me from the second that I saw it, and I really like the title. So tell me a little bit about that. I know authors don't have a ton of say in the cover, but I know a lot of times there is some back and forth.
Okay, so I had a ton of say in this cover, actually.
Oh, good. Oh, I love that. Half the time authors say, I don't really have any say. And I'm like, well, some authors do. So that's great. Well, tell me about it.
So the cover was done by B. Mike, Brandon Odoms, who's from New Orleans. He does Studio B. He does all kind of murals all over the place. And, he just does these really sort of beautiful renderings of Black history with these sort of, spray paint graffiti style. And we go back to when I first started as a journalist in New Orleans, 2010. He was filming sort of like guerrilla style rap videos, and I was like trying to cover the videos, and like I'd try to, I'd use him to get onto the set, and he'd use me to, if I could write about it, and if I needed an interview and all that stuff. And so he would film the interviews. And so, but now he's sort of blown up into this, major artist. I mean, he also did the cover to Will Smith's book.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and now that you're saying that, I can see the similarities because that's a fabulous cover too.
Right, yeah. So he did that, which, he did. When I officially asked him to do the cover, I was like, well, I just finished doing this Will Smith book. Do you think that? I was like, well, we're doing it anyway. So, so he does all of this tremendous work. And so as soon as I got, knew that we were doing the book, I was like, I want B. Mike to do my cover. Because, I mean, it's New Orleans, there's that history in New Orleans, there's our history, there's so much of the book is about keeping things within your circle and growing with people and things like that. So I was like, I want B Mike to do this cover. I pushed for him. I was like, please, y'all just reach out to him. He'll do it. And he did, and I gave, and that was it. So I didn't have any sort of guidance on what actually went on the cover, because I was just like, look, he'll just do whatever and it'll look nice. I'm trusting his vision, trusting him with it, and that's what he did, and it looks fantastic. So yes, that was how the cover came about.
I love that story.
Yeah, I mean, this just speaks so much to the spirit of the book on a lot of different levels.
And what about the title, The Movement Made Us?
So the title, yes, that came. So I was originally writing a much more vexed and darker book based on where my mind was at the time of all this, and extreme frustration with everything going on, and just thinking about sort of the conversation we had earlier, and like all these people have sacrificed, and we're at this place where we have all this going on in the country, and I was extremely so. One of the original title was "I'm Tired of Funerals," which is something that my dad said at James Chaney's funeral, and it was sort of going to highlight a lot of the people who my dad knew. I mean, it still does that, who are no longer hearing things like that. But that just sort of was too, took away too much from what was actually the beauty of what these folks accomplished. And so that just came from a brainstorming thing. I think it just worked on a lot of different levels with the word with us, with me and my dad, with the entire country, with the generation. And the idea of movement also fascinated me, and the movement itself, but the way that my dad move from place to place, and the way that we are moving together. So movement and us sort of were the two words that sort of stuck with me, and that just came, and that made it all the way through. I mean, that was sort of in the final stages of the proposal, and that made it all the way through to the cover.
Well, I do love the title, and I hadn't really thought about it having multiple meanings. And I always think it's wonderful when a title does, because then you think of several different things as you're looking at it. And I love the movement aspect of it.
Yes, that was something, and again, originally a lot of this was going to be done while my dad and I were traveling together. So there was going to be a little bit more movement going on through the book, but obviously we couldn't do that, but I think it still sort of holds up.
Absolutely. But what have you read lately that you really liked?
So I've read South to America, which is probably my favorite thing I've read so far this year, which is Imani Perry's book, where she travels through different places in the South and just does this thing that only Imani Perry can do, where she just converges all of these ideas and histories onto the page, and it's just her just totally in her bag, and it's incredibly brilliant.
That would be a good one paired with your book as well. I actually have it in Libro FM. It's up next for me to listen to, and I've heard such great things about it.
Yeah, so Imani Perry has been extremely influential in my writing. I held her book Breathe, Letter to My Sons, and Kiese Layman's Heavy very, very close to me while I was writing this book, especially just thinking about how to write about these relationships with people in my family. So I'm forever indebted to Imani Perry for her brilliance and just this. Yeah, and I hope that we do get to talk at some point, after the book is out, because I think that the books sort of are play cousins, as we like to say.
Oh, I love that. Anything else that you've read that you loved?
So today I just picked up Danyel Smith's Shine Bright, which is like Danyel Smith is she used to be my editor, and is for me the most important pop culture writer of my generation. She was, used to edit Vibe magazine. She was editor at Billboard, and it is a sort of part memoir, part history of Black women in music. And I was able to read a little bit of it ahead of time. Now today, April 19th is the release date, and I've picked it up, and I am going to cancel all my plans because I am locked in on this book.
That sounds really good. I'm going to have to add that to my Libro FM account as well.
Yeah, she's just fantastic, and I've been looking forward to this book for a while.
Well, thank you. And thank you, David, for joining me today to talk about The Movement Made Us. There were no panic attacks, no stress. All went great.
We made it. We made it.
We made it. Thanks for coming on the Thoughts from a Page podcast. And I can't wait for everyone to read The Movement Made Us.
Thank you so much.
Women's Running Stories, where we explore the intersection between running and life. Because every woman who is committed to a running journey has a story to tell, and this is where you'll find those stories. I am host and producer Cherie Louise Turner. I'm a 53-year-old runner, and together with original music by musician and runner Cormac O'Regan, we bring these inspirational stories to life. Please join us to fuel your adventures.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. If you like this episode, and I hope you did, please follow me on Instagram at Thoughts From A Page. Consider joining my Patreon group to access bonus content and support the podcast. Tell all of your friends about the show and rate it or subscribe to it wherever you listen to your podcasts. I would really appreciate it. The book discussed in this episode can be purchased at my bookshop storefront, and the link is in the show notes. I hope you'll tune in next time.
I'm Allison Holland, host of the Kennedy Dynasty podcast. Equipped with a microphone and a long-term fascination of the Kennedy family, I am joined by an incredible cast of experts, friends, and guests to take you on a fun, relaxed, yet informative journey through history and pop culture. From book references to fashion to philanthropy to our modern expectations of the presidency itself, you'll see that there is so much more to Kennedy than just JFK or conspiracy theories. Join me for the Kennedy Dynasty podcast.